Hi, beautiful community. With your permission, I want to repeat something that I usually say, but just a little bit more slowly, about the crisis of trust in our democracies. I'm just really asking you to indulge me in that for 5+ minutes, definitely no more than 10. So let's go for it. Not long before she died, the British politician Shirley Williams would sometimes talk about the crisis of trust we're facing in politics being the biggest one since the middle of the 19th century, since the revolutions of 1848. That's not to say it's the biggest political crisis since then. It's not. And there is no point in freaking out more than we need to. Our boats are coming out of the bay and heading into choppy waters as we experience democratic decline over the next years and decades. But that doesn't mean our boats are going to sink, and that doesn't mean that democratic decline is democratic collapse. Democracies can coexist with crisis, as it were. But it does mean, back to Shirley Williams, that as far as crises of trust go, this is the worst for a long time. And I want to talk in this chat about the 4 feelings voters have which make them distrust political institutions and sometimes all public institutions, starting from the least worrying feeling to the most worrying feeling, to the feeling that most threatens the fabric of democratic life. The first, perhaps most innocent feeling that a voter has is this feeling of being unsafe. And that's the feeling that their government or their public institutions are incompetent or perhaps a bit corrupt. So it's like feeling unsafe because you're on a boat where you just don't trust the person driving it because they might just crash it into the rocks. And that is a perennial feeling in politics. It's a feeling that a lot of voters have always had, no matter what moment of cultural moment in politics we turn to historically. And that's why it's the least worrying of the 4 feelings. You don't want voters to have it too much, but it's just inevitably going to be there. The second feeling that is more worrying is the feeling of powerlessness. It's the feeling that there goes the political process, and I, as a voter, am sort of dealing with something that is there in front of me in a kind of cocoon, or maybe I'm in a cocoon and there's just no interpenetration. So there is nothing I can do, no matter how infinitesimal, to inflect the trajectory of the political process. I feel that there's nothing I can do to touch politics. And worst of all, most absurdly, I even feel that about my local politics. I feel there's nothing I can even do locally that inflects where politics in my local area goes. What happens with the bench down the street, what happens with the couple of trees on that corner, what happens with the speed limits in my local area. So it's the feeling that I can no longer touch politics at all. And you're only one voter, so you don't expect to change your country's politics by sort of putting your finger on the scales. But you expect to have a tiny capacity to inflect and to causally interact with the process. You don't expect to be just completely and utterly ostracized and powerless. And that is a feeling that voters increasingly have. They just feel they cannot touch politics at all. And I think some voters are beginning to suspect that members of parliament and their political representatives sometimes themselves can't touch politics much, because there are forces like the forces of globalization, for instance, which they can't control, or because political institutions are so complex and so constrained that political representatives are themselves quite powerless. So it's like a powerlessness to touch a process that is itself enacted by people who seem rather powerless in it potentially. The third feeling, and this is getting worse, is the feeling of betrayal. And that's the feeling that the most basic relationship in a democracy has broken down. And that is your relationship with me, if we're citizens of the same country. That is a relationship of opposition, but not a relationship of friend and foe, not a relationship of enemies. So that's like you and I trying to play a game of tennis. We might enjoy beating each other. We might be very keen to beat each other. We might dislike each other and really want to rub it in with a good 6-2 victory if we're playing a single set. But we're not going to try to bonk each other on the head with tennis rackets. We're not going to try to, confiscate each other's rehydration drink. We're not going to try to make each other slip on the court, because that, in turn, will actually stop us from beating each other properly, right? It'll take the sweetness of victory away. And that reveals how far the relationship of opposition is also necessarily a relationship of cooperation. And that relationship of opposition in a democracy is necessarily tied to values we share in common, such as some sense of the public good. Doesn't mean we have to agree on what the public good is. We just have to agree that we're constantly orientated toward it, right? That we want to conflict about what it is, to debate what it is, to advance our own picture of it, but nevertheless we're orientated toward the idea that there is such a thing that's worth fighting over. The same goes with trust, and the same goes with fairness. I beg your pardon. It's not that we agree on what fairness is, but that we agree that we are debating and conflicting and challenging each other over what fair outcomes in our society might be. So this is the big difference between relations of opposition versus relations of enemies. And so the feeling you begin to have about somebody who is your enemy, and not just your political opponent, is that they are evil. And the way this very typically works in practice is that voters begin to feel that their political representatives are favoring some group who is designated as outsiders. They might literally be outsiders, or they could be citizens of the country, right? Exclusively construed, in an exclusionary way, construed as outsiders. And then there is the feeling, whoa, our politicians are favoring these outsiders over us. That must be evil. Nobody who isn't evil would do that. Right? And that is how people can come to think that Joe Biden is evil. And then, as it's palpably the case that some American voters think that Joe Biden is evil, so people who support, or indeed reluctantly support, Joe Biden might think that the other side is evil, because in thinking that Joe Biden is evil, they're trying to break the democratic game. And here this relationship of opponents is broken down and descended into a relationship of enemies. So feeling unsafe, feeling powerless, feeling betrayed, and now we come to the worst of it. And that is this feeling voters have when they look at their political institutions, at their public institutions, at their political representatives, and feel that what they're seeing no longer makes sense. And here Chuck Taylor, the wonderful Canadian philosopher Charles Taylor, sometimes uses the word that I also use and steal, and I highly recommend it as well, opacity. And that's about designating the feeling that, in this analogy I constantly reheat for us, that a voter feels like they're looking out onto some kind of field, and on it there are 4 or 5 sports being played, all mixed into one. So there is football, soccer, there is basketball, there is tennis, there is curling, and there is swimming, even though there is no water. So you're looking at it and it doesn't make any sense. So you're not just saying, I can't touch this thing, or this thing is working against me, or this thing is incompetent. So, powerless, betrayed, unsafe. You're looking at it and it's unintelligible. It makes no sense. And that is a feeling when a voter can no longer not just touch politics, it's when a voter can no longer even see politics. And what that does is it has the tendency of reducing a voter's causal thought about politics to zero. Now, causal thought is always a bit broken down. That is to say, how is a politician who I may give my vote to going to achieve what I'd like them to achieve? What mechanisms are they going to use? In what timing will they do it? Whose support will they use? What will the outcome look like in the end? So this business of cause and effect, causal relationships, right? So what's going to happen is that my prime minister will have a cabinet meeting, then they will have some consultations, then that will be the role of the civil service, then this will be the trajectory of what they do next, and then some kind of bill might be put together, and blah, 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 blah. And eventually we get to a situation where we have a political outcome. So even if it's hazy and vague and a bit wrong and sloppy, I'm still imagining as kind of a chain of political causation leading to an outcome that I might prefer. This is always a bit broken down in politics because in the modern world especially there is a big gap between private life and the public sphere. And it's just really difficult to properly grasp the workings of the public sphere because its processes, its language, the way it justifies things to itself and to the citizenry is at a distance from how we talk about things in our private lives. And this is interestingly something that populists, destructive but also constructive populists, are trying to bridge. They're trying to get the public sphere to look more, talk more, feel more like the kitchen table. But that's a conversation for another time. So the point is that this causal way of seeing politics is always a bit depleted. But when you find your political institutions opaque, when you find them unintelligible, it just collapses to zero. And you end up with a complete absence of causal thought. I'm going to make America great again. Well, how are you going to do that? What's going to happen? Can you name any sort of causal mechanism? No. So we end up with a situation where we're going down to the street and we're taking down some oranges from a tree to make a steak dinner. It just no longer adds up causally. Or we're chopping the tree down to make a salad for dinner. How is that connected? This is a completely broken down relationship. I am supporting this political candidate. He's going to chop down the tree and I'm going to have salad for my dinner. And chopping down the tree will stop the really bad actors who are invisible behind the scenes, who are stopping the salad from appearing on my dinner plate. But here is what's really important to understand about the disposition of chop down the tree so I can have salad, right? This unintelligibility, opacity leading to breakdown of causality. That instinct is still a democratic instinct. This feeling of opacity and as a result, perhaps preferring some course of action that makes no causal sense, or just wanting to throw eggs and tomatoes at the political system because it's opaque, doesn't make sense, doesn't feel like it's worth preserving. That instinct is a deeply democratic instinct. It contains the desire to have institutions that work for you. It contains the desire to have a voice in politics when you feel like you don't, some sense of agency when you feel like you have none. And it even contains, in some sense, the thirst for not being duped and the thirst for truth. Because you want to break out of this picture where nothing makes sense. And that is a kind of a desire to stand in a relationship to your political institutions that is more truthful. The trouble here is that this desire to not get duped leads one to give up completely on one's political institutions and in turn to give up on truth itself. That's a very interesting relation. I don't want to be tricked. I'm so worried about being tricked that I'm going to give up on trusting anything, including the difference between truth and lies. So that grounding that I'm sort of really pedantically insisting on for us now is really important. Because what I don't want us to do is to say that this person who is feeling this opacity about their institutions is disinformed, misinformed, and irrational. And that's all that there is to it. And they just need to get rational. No, right? That itself is a kind of denial and a kind of illusion about our political situation. When you say that to somebody who's completely given up on politics, you yourself have given up on politics as it is, and then you're now both in the same camp, right? You're both now not any longer dealing with the reality of what may need to happen on that field. You're beginning to proceed in terms of just disconnecting your monitors from that field altogether and just floating in unconstructive space, pre-political, post-political space. So it's a kind of demophobic, elitist mistake to think that this opacity feeling and the consequent sort of escape from causality and the consequent destructive impulse to throw eggs and tomatoes at this field of games that makes no sense. It's a sort of demophobic elitist mistake to think that that is just a case of anti-democratic misinformation, disinformation, irrationality. That itself is driven by a democratic instinct. And what it shows is that our democracies need help. They need resuscitation, not that your fellow voters need re-education. I just wanted to land on that for us, and I'm just so grateful you've survived this rant, especially as I know those of you who love my communication and my content have heard this before. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.